The Galactic Concordance Academy was a beacon of interstellar collaboration, drawing recruits from the most powerful species in the known universe. Its training programs were infamous, designed to break cadets and mold them into the ultimate warriors. Earth had been newly inducted into the Concordance, and most species viewed humans with curiosity tinged with skepticism. Earth, after all, was a Class-5 Deathworld, a rarity in the galaxy. Deathworlds bred survivors. Their inhabitants evolved through constant exposure to lethal predators, extreme climates, and endless competition. Yet, humanity's inclusion in the Concordance was a recent and controversial decision. Many species doubted their worth. Others feared their potential. When Cadet Thomas Hale stepped off the transport shuttle, the other recruits sized him up with dismissive glances. The Nazurians, with their chitinous exoskeletons, hissed softly, amused at his fleshy appearance. The Ulari, towering amphibians with bulbous eyes and rippling muscles, stared with vague disinterest. Even the instructors, a cadre of fearsome Zarnak warriors known for their uncompromising rigor, barely acknowledged his presence. Thomas, however, observed everything. His unassuming demeanor masked a razor-sharp mind honed by years of survival instinct. Earth had taught him to adapt to any challenge. The academy was just another test, and he was ready. The orientation was a blur of alien languages, holographic maps, and rules that seemed designed to intimidate. The first challenge came quickly. The Survival Dynamics course, a grueling week-long simulation hailed as the Academy's most demanding trial. Cadets were required to navigate hostile terrain, fend off simulated enemies, and survive with minimal resources. Most recruits failed. Those who succeeded emerged changed, their resolve hardened by the experience. Thomas listened carefully as Drill Sergeant Crowner, a Zarnak veteran with an intimidating array of scars, outlined the course. The alien's deep, guttural voice boomed through the briefing room. "This is not a game," Crowner growled, pacing before the assembled recruits. "This is not some childish exercise. The Survival Dynamics course will strip you to your core. It will expose every weakness. And it will crush those unworthy of the Concordance. Only the strongest will prevail." Thomas raised a hand. The room fell silent, every eye on him. "Question, Cadet?" Crowner snarled. "How long does it usually take to finish?" Crowner's eyes narrowed. "A week. If you're still alive by the end, you pass." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Got it." The other cadets snickered. The humans' arrogance, they thought, would be their downfall. The simulation began the next day. The cadets were dropped into a vast holographic environment that mimicked the harshest environments from across the galaxy. Thomas landed in a dense jungle teeming with venomous creatures and aggressive drones. He scanned the surroundings, his mind racing. Unlike the others, Thomas didn't panic. He analyzed. He adapted. Within minutes, he had fashioned crude tools from the environment and dispatched the nearest drones with alarming precision. Hours passed, and Thomas moved like a ghost through the simulation. Where other cadets struggled to find water, he located a hidden spring. Where others fell into traps, he dismantled them and used the materials to create makeshift weapons. By the 1-hour mark, Thomas had neutralized every threat, secured all objectives, and reached the extraction point. The system registered his completion with a sharp chime. "Simulation complete," the automated voice announced. Thomas stepped out of the holographic chamber, dusting himself off. A technician stared at him, slack-jawed. "You're done," the technician stammered. "Yeah," Thomas replied casually. "It was fun. Can I grab lunch now?" The news spread like wildfire. Drill Sergeant Crowner stormed into the control room, demanding an explanation. When he reviewed the footage, his mandibles clicked nervously, a rare display of unease for a Zarnak. Thomas hadn't just completed the course. He had done so with a level of efficiency that bordered on terrifying. Every move was calculated, every decision flawless. The cadet had turned a week-long crucible into a casual stroll. The Academy's instructors gathered in a hastily convened meeting. Panic rippled through the ranks. If one human could do this, what were the implications for the Concordance? Were they training an ally or a potential threat? Thomas, oblivious to the growing alarm, lounged in the mess hall, enjoying a meal. He noticed the furtive glances from the other cadets but shrugged them off. Earth had prepared him for far worse than gossip. Back in the control room, Crowner replayed the footage for the third time. Each viewing deepened his unease. The human wasn't just skilled, he was something else entirely. Something unpredictable. And unpredictability, in the hands of a Deathworlder, was the most dangerous weapon of all. In the following days, the Academy buzzed with whispers about Thomas. Cadets from across the galaxy shared tales of the human who completed survival dynamics in an hour. Some were impressed, others were skeptical. Among the instructors, the mood was tense. The Zarnak sergeants were particularly perturbed. They prided themselves on breaking recruits and molding them into warriors. Thomas had undermined their authority, and they didn't like it. Drill Sergeant Crowner summoned Thomas to his office. The human arrived promptly, his posture relaxed but alert. Crowner loomed behind his desk, his clawed hands resting heavily on its surface. "Cadet Hale," Crowner began, his voice low and measured, "do you understand the purpose of this academy?" "To prepare us for service in the Galactic Concordance," Thomas replied without hesitation. "And do you believe that rushing through a course designed to test your limits demonstrates readiness for such service?" Thomas tilted his head slightly, considering his words. "With respect, sir, I didn't rush. I solved the problems as efficiently as I could." "Isn't that the goal of survival training?" Crowner's mandibles twitched. "The goal, cadet, is to test endurance, resilience, and adaptability over an extended period. By completing the course so quickly, you have bypassed the challenges intended to shape you." Thomas met Crowner's gaze steadily. "I disagree, sir. I faced the challenges. I just didn't let them slow me down." Crowner leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "Do not mistake efficiency for superiority, cadet. The galaxy is vast and unforgiving. You are not invincible." Thomas nodded respectfully. "Understood, sir." But as Thomas left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that Crowner's warning was as much about fear as it was about discipline. The Zarnak were a proud species, and his performance had shaken them. Meanwhile, the Academy's higher-ups convened in a private meeting. Among them was Admiral Thress, an Andari with translucent skin that shimmered under the light. She had overseen the Academy for decades and had never encountered a situation like this. "This human represents an anomaly," Thress said, her melodic voice tinged with concern. "We need to determine whether he is an outlier or indicative of his species' potential." One of the Zarnak instructors, Lieutenant Ralvik, crossed his arms. "If they're all like him, the Concordance has underestimated Earth's capabilities. This could be problematic." Another voice, softer but firm, interjected. It belonged to Professor Kellen, a Rillian biologist and the Academy's chief scientist. "Before we jump to conclusions, we should conduct further evaluations. Cadet Hale's performance may simply be the result of unique circumstances." The council agreed. Over the next week, Thomas was subjected to a series of increasingly difficult challenges. Advanced combat simulations, endurance trials, and psychological stress tests were thrown at him in rapid succession. Each time, he excelled with a calm efficiency that left his evaluators baffled. The other cadets watched from the sidelines, their initial skepticism giving way to awe and, in some cases, resentment. The Nazurian contingent, in particular, began to see Thomas as a threat to their dominance. A few of them plotted ways to undermine him during team exercises. Thomas, for his part, remained focused. He had grown up on Earth, where competition was a way of life. He recognized the subtle hostility of his peers but chose to ignore it. His priority was to prove himself, not to them, but to the Concordance. The final test came unexpectedly. Without warning, the cadets were pulled from their quarters and loaded onto transport ships. Thomas found himself alongside a mixed group of recruits, including some of the more antagonistic Nazurians. The transport dropped them on an uncharted planet, its surface a maze of jagged rocks and dense forests. The objective was simple: reach the extraction point within 48 hours. But as Thomas surveyed the terrain, he realized the test wasn't just about survival. It was about teamwork and sabotage. The Nazurians wasted no time asserting dominance. Their leader, a hulking figure named Garrick, barked orders, directing the group toward a path he claimed was the safest route. Thomas observed quietly, his instincts telling him that Garrick had other motives. Hours into the trek, it became clear that Garrick's plan was leading them into danger. The group encountered a swarm of robotic sentinels, their weapons calibrated to stun but powerful enough to incapacitate. Chaos erupted as the cadets scattered. Thomas moved swiftly, using the terrain to his advantage. He noticed Garrick and his followers retreating, leaving the others to fend for themselves. "Figures," Thomas muttered, slipping through the shadows to regroup with the abandoned cadets. He quickly organized the scattered recruits, using his knowledge of the planet's environment to guide them to safety. Despite their initial wariness, they began to follow his lead. By the time they reached the extraction point, they had not only survived but thrived under Thomas's guidance. Garrick and his group arrived hours later, battered and exhausted. The drill sergeants were waiting, their expressions unreadable. As the cadets boarded the transport back to the academy, Crowner pulled Thomas aside. "You could have left them behind," Crowner said. "Why didn't you?" Thomas shrugged. "Survival isn't just about strength. It's about knowing when to fight and when to help." Crowner regarded him silently for a moment, then nodded. "Perhaps there's hope for you yet, cadet." Back at the academy, Thomas's actions during the final test solidified his reputation. He wasn't just a skilled individual, he was a leader. The instructors, though still uneasy, began to see him in a new light. But the question lingered: was Thomas Hale a prodigy or a harbinger of what humanity could become? Thomas's reputation spread beyond the academy. Reports of his extraordinary performance reached the Galactic Concordance's Central Command. High-ranking officials and scientists began to scrutinize the footage of his training sessions. Some were intrigued, others deeply concerned. Meanwhile, back at the academy, Thomas's life became increasingly complicated. While some cadets admired his skills and leadership, others viewed him as a threat. The Nazurians, still smarting from their humiliation during the team exercise, were particularly hostile. Garrick, their leader, was not one to let a grudge go. He gathered his closest allies in the dormitory's communal lounge, their exoskeletons clinking ominously as they plotted. "This human thinks he's better than us," Garrick snarled, his multifaceted eyes glinting with malice. "We'll show him his place." His plan was simple: provoke Thomas into a fight during the next combat training session. If they could push him hard enough, they hoped to expose a weakness, or at least get him disciplined. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The academy announced a combat tournament, a tradition that pitted cadets against each other in controlled duels. Thomas entered reluctantly, knowing that refusing would only draw more attention. He had no desire to humiliate anyone, but he also understood the importance of standing his ground. The first few matches were uneventful. Thomas dispatched his opponents quickly but without malice, using precise, efficient moves that left them unharmed. His restraint, however, only seemed to infuriate Garrick and his followers. When the bracket narrowed, Thomas found himself facing Garrick in the quarterfinals. The tension in the arena was palpable as the two squared off. The other cadets gathered to watch, their whispers a mixture of anticipation and unease. Garrick wasted no time, charging at Thomas with a ferocity that bordered on reckless. His claws swiped through the air, each strike intended to intimidate. But Thomas remained calm, sidestepping with fluid precision. He countered with a series of well-placed blows, each one calculated to subdue rather than harm. The fight ended almost as soon as it began. Garrick lay sprawled on the ground, his exoskeleton cracked but intact. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some cheering, others shaking their heads. Thomas extended a hand to help Garrick up, but the Nazurian slapped it away, his pride wounded more than his body. "You think this makes you superior?" Garrick hissed. "You're just a freak. An anomaly." Thomas met his glare evenly. "Maybe. But that's not my problem." As Thomas walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the conflict with Garrick was far from over. He was right. The next day, Thomas was summoned to the command center. Admiral Thress herself greeted him, her translucent form shimmering in the room's dim light. Beside her stood Professor Kellen, the Rillian biologist who had been studying his performance. "Cadet Hale," Thress began, her voice calm but authoritative. "Your abilities have raised questions. The Concordance has decided to conduct a formal evaluation of Earth's potential as a member species. You will represent your planet in a series of advanced trials." Thomas frowned. "Trials? Haven't I already proven myself?" "Individually, yes," Thress said. "But the Concordance is concerned about the broader implications of humanity's capabilities. These trials will determine whether your species is an asset or a threat." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'll do my best." The first trial was unlike anything Thomas had faced before. He was placed in a simulated battlefield alongside a team of cadets from other species. The goal was to secure a series of objectives while fending off waves of enemy drones. The simulation was designed to test not only combat skills but also teamwork and strategic thinking. From the outset, it was clear that tensions were high. The Nazurians on his team were openly hostile, refusing to follow his suggestions. The Olari cadets were more neutral, but their towering forms made them cumbersome in the tight corridors of the battlefield. Only a small, agile Yelvarian named Cora seemed willing to cooperate. Despite the challenges, Thomas adapted. He used his knowledge of Earth's chaotic ecosystems to predict the drones' patterns and devised unconventional strategies that turned the tide of the battle. When the Nazurians' refusal to cooperate put the team in danger, Thomas took charge, issuing orders with such authority that even Garrick begrudgingly followed. By the end of the trial, the team had not only completed the objectives but had done so in record time. The instructors were both impressed and unsettled. Thomas's leadership had turned a dysfunctional group into a cohesive unit, a feat that spoke to humanity's potential for both collaboration and domination. The remaining trials were equally grueling, testing everything from endurance in extreme environments to moral decision-making under duress. In each trial, Thomas excelled, but not without difficulty. The psychological toll began to weigh on him, as did the constant scrutiny. He missed the camaraderie of his squad on Earth, the simple trust that came from shared struggles. Here, every interaction felt like a test, every ally a potential rival. Back at the academy, the reactions among the cadets varied. Some, like Cora, admired Thomas and sought to learn from him. Others, like Garrick, grew more resentful, seeing him as a symbol of humanity's encroachment on galactic affairs. The final trial was shrouded in secrecy. Thomas was transported to a secure facility, where he was briefed by Admiral Thress and Professor Kellen. The trial, they explained, was not a simulation but a real mission. A rogue faction had taken control of a mining station on a remote moon, and Thomas would lead a team to reclaim it. "This is not just a test," Thress said. "This is your chance to prove that humanity can be trusted to handle real power." Thomas nodded, the weight of the task settling on his shoulders. He knew that the outcome would shape not only his future but also Earth's place in the galaxy. As he prepared for the mission, Thomas reflected on everything he had learned. Survival wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about understanding others, about knowing when to fight and when to compromise. And it was about finding a way forward, even in the face of overwhelming odds. He was ready. The transport ship hummed softly as it sped toward the desolate moon. Thomas sat in the cramped cabin alongside his team, a mixed group of cadets selected for the mission. Despite their varied backgrounds, none could hide their apprehension. This wasn't a simulation. Lives were at stake. The mission briefing had been brief but thorough. The mining station, vital for extracting a rare mineral used in starship reactors, had been overrun by a rogue faction. The rogue group, primarily composed of disenfranchised mercenaries from various species, had fortified the station and were holding its crew hostage. The Concordance had deemed the situation too delicate for direct military intervention. Instead, they had chosen Thomas's team to resolve the crisis discreetly. As the ship entered the moon's thin atmosphere, Thomas reviewed the plan one last time. The team would infiltrate the station through its maintenance tunnels, disable the rogue faction's defenses, and secure the hostages. Simple on paper, but the reality promised to be far more complex. Cora, the Yelvarian cadet, sat beside him, her small frame dwarfed by the bulky Ulari on her other side. She glanced at Thomas, her large eyes filled with determination. "You think we can pull this off?" she asked. "We don't have a choice," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "We stick to the plan, adapt if things go sideways, and watch each other's backs. That's how we win." Garrick, seated across from them, snorted. "Spare us the speeches, human. Just don't screw this up." Thomas didn't respond. He knew Garrick's hostility was more about pride than logic. For now, they needed to focus on the mission. The transport landed in the shadow of a massive crater, its engines kicking up plumes of fine dust. The team disembarked quickly, their equipment secured and weapons at the ready. The moon's surface was barren, its stark landscape illuminated by the distant glow of its parent planet. In the distance, the mining station loomed, its metal structure partially buried in the rocky terrain. Thomas led the way, his sharp eyes scanning for potential threats. The maintenance tunnels were exactly where the briefing had indicated, hidden beneath a thick layer of debris. With Cora's help, he pried open the hatch, revealing a dark, narrow passage that descended into the station's underbelly. The team moved in silence, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. The tunnels were cramped and poorly lit, forcing them to rely on their helmet-mounted lights. The air was thick with a metallic tang of processed ore, mingled with a faint scent of something burnt. As they approached the station's core, the sound of voices filtered through the walls. The rogues were close. Thomas signaled for the team to halt, raising a hand for silence. He motioned for Cora to scout ahead, her small size and natural agility making her the ideal candidate. She returned moments later, her expression grim. "They've set up a perimeter. At least 10 guards, heavily armed. The hostages are in a separate chamber, but they're guarded too." Thomas nodded, formulating a plan. "We split into 2 groups. Group 1 creates a distraction to draw the guards away from the hostages. Group 2 moves in to secure them. Cora, you're with me. Garrick, take Group 1 and make some noise." Garrick glared at him but didn't argue. As much as he disliked Thomas, he couldn't deny the logic of the plan. The operation began smoothly. Garrick's group set off a series of controlled explosions in a nearby section of the station, drawing the guards away from their posts. Thomas and Cora used the distraction to slip into the hostage chamber, taking out the remaining guards with swift precision. The hostages, an assortment of miners and engineers, were shaken but unharmed. Thomas quickly assessed their condition and directed them toward the maintenance tunnels. As the last of the hostages were evacuated, the situation took a turn. The rogue faction, realizing they had been outmaneuvered, launched a counterattack. The station's alarms blared as reinforcements flooded into the area. Thomas's team found themselves pinned down, their escape route cut off. "Suggestions?" Cora asked, ducking behind cover as a barrage of plasma fire lit up the room. Thomas scanned the environment, his mind racing. The station's power core was nearby, a volatile reactor that could be overloaded to create a temporary EMP. It would disable the rogues' weapons and give them the opening they needed. "It's risky," Thomas said, outlining the plan. "But it's our best shot." The team moved quickly, fighting their way to the power core. Garrick, despite his earlier antagonism, proved invaluable in holding off the enemy while Thomas and Cora worked to overload the reactor. Sweat dripped down Thomas's face as he manipulated the controls, bypassing layers of security protocols. "Almost there," he muttered. The reactor emitted a high-pitched whine, its systems straining under the overload. Thomas grabbed the comm unit. "Brace yourselves. EMP in 3, 2, 1. The station trembled as the EMP burst rippled outward. The lights flickered, and the rogues' weapons fell silent. Thomas and his team seized the moment, regrouping with the hostages and making a swift retreat through the tunnels. By the time the rogues recovered, the transport ship was already lifting off, its engines roaring as it carried Thomas and the others to safety. Back at the academy, the mission's success was met with mixed reactions. The instructors praised Thomas's leadership and quick thinking, while the cadets who had doubted him began to see him in a new light. Even Garrick, grudgingly, offered a nod of respect. But the higher-ups in the Concordance were not entirely reassured. The mission had proven humanity's potential, but it had also highlighted the unpredictability and ingenuity that made Deathworlders both valuable and dangerous. In the following weeks, Thomas continued his training, navigating the complex web of relationships and expectations at the Academy. He knew that his journey was far from over. Earth's place in the galaxy was still uncertain, and he would need to keep proving himself, not just for his sake, but for the future of humanity. As Thomas looked out over the Academy grounds, he allowed himself a small smile. The galaxy might be vast and unforgiving, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because survival wasn't just about getting through the day. It was about thriving, and Thomas Hale was a survivor in every sense of the word.